rallies, and I think it's been powerful in actually finding allies to this cause. And I think that's adding power to the voice, but it's not just the solo aspect of it. In Bendigo, we saw over 1,000 people come together. We heard from 3 very amazing, powerful women who had all experienced sexual violence. And for me, the takeaway from the rally, which I hope really came out for all who attended, was that sexual assault is very traumatic and it has a huge impact on your life, but it doesn't define you, and you can recover and you can have a voice and you can influence and impact change. So for me, I want to see that the work from the march continues, and I think it'll be good for us today to talk about what's next and how do we keep the energy going.
Thanks, Kate. Did you have any reflections, Julie, on the past few weeks?
I think I might have been involved in the violence against women sector for more than 30 years, and I don't think I've seen such rage as I've seen this time. That's different. You know, we've had lots and lots of rallies and lots of protests, lots of work over the decades, you know, with the emergence of women's refuges in the 70s. And there's been so much lip service. There's been so many policy changes towards gender equality. There's been so many legislative changes, so much lip service saying that, you know, government really believes in gender equality and reducing violence against women and children. But what's happened over the last couple of weeks, focused on Parliament House, has just shown that it was effectively lip service and not structural. And to get structural change, we've actually got to deal with this really effectively. We can't let them get away with this. We have leadership that says that they support safety for women, and leadership, political leadership that says that they support no violence against women and equality, and but also say things like, but not at the expense of men. And also have different standards, you know, one for Brittany Higgins and one for the Attorney General. So I think the rage that I've seen over the last couple of weeks was just demonstrated in approximately 100,000 people marching across the country or gathering across the country for the recent event. And I think we've got to maintain that rage, as we say, because we can't let them get away with this. We can't let our top lawmaker have those sorts of accusations against him and be involved in similar laws that he's been accused of and not have some sort of independent inquiry. I think Prime Minister saying, yes, I support women getting equality, but not at the sake of men, completely means he doesn't get the whole thing. You know, I mean, it was so heartening to see so many men at the march in Bendigo the other day as allies for women. It was amazing to see so many women from all different age groups, from all different backgrounds, young women, older women, able women, women with disabilities, different women from different cultural backgrounds. It was absolutely amazing. And we've got to keep inching forward. We've gone so far over the last 40 years that we cannot let this political leadership take us backwards.
Thanks, Julie. And Tricia, did you have any reflections that you wanted to add to that?
Thanks, Nicole. And adding on to, I think, the lovely context that's been already set there by Kate and Julie, it has been a remarkable few weeks, but it's also been a remarkable 12 months, 18 months, and it's been a remarkable decade, and it's been a remarkable century, and so it goes on. And it's remarkable because we have seen injustice spoken of, demonstrated to, and we have not seen significant changes that we need to have in our communities, in our society, to ensure a very basic human right for women and girls, that they can actually live safely in their community. So you can almost hear the exclamation marks against my comments in that it is extraordinary, isn't it, that we can be so aware and yet have not been able to affect the change that needs to happen. Julie's absolutely right in terms of speaking, and Kate in terms of speaking to that structural change. That's what we need to see our actions really focused on. And also understand that we get to that structural change by every single one of us, women and our allies, taking into their lives the capacity to actually call out sexist behaviour, challenge those gender stereotypes that have held men and women in roles that are not enabling women's human rights to be experienced. So it's been this, Monday was it was a flash. I'm going to say a flash. It was a pretty decent roll, wasn't it? With so many people turning out, but it's getting its, hopefully this is what we're looking for here is, with our anger and with our tiredness, that the hope sits in that this is the tipping point, that this will now tip us into the actions, that we've called for, that will actually start to implement the structural changes that we absolutely need to, what do we say? I think the other day too in Roslyn Park, I looked at so many of the signs. They were terrific, those signs, they spoke about the anger and being fed up and, that these are human rights that we're here for. Some of them reflected the names of women who are not here with their voice because of the violence that they had experienced through their deaths. And it is an absolute moment in time, but not a singular one. It's one building on those that come before it and preparing for those that will come after it. And it is absolutely a movement that we're seeing and hearing now. And the work that we have to do, we all have to do, is to keep that momentum rolling in actions.
The signs were amazing, weren't they? I've been thinking about making a little video collection of them because it'd be great to capture as many as possible. Yvette, we had a brief conversation this morning about your reflections of Monday, and you were quite heartened and encouraged by the number of young women who were there. Would you like to perhaps talk about your thoughts after Monday in the past few weeks?
Yes. Thanks, Nick, and thanks to Julie and Tricia and Kate for your reflections, and that certainly provoked a lot of thinking. So there's a lot of things I could talk about, but I think that look, one of the things that I did notice as I talked to you about this morning, Nick, was the representation across the generations. So we had young women, and we had women who have been women and their allies who have been out there protesting for too long. Women who were found it surprising or were dismayed to find themselves still out there aiming to be heard, but the energy and anger of the young women, and particularly the allies of the young women, because it's really important for this to be a community movement, but that was really heartening for me. And I did wonder, where I've been thinking about we know where the anger has come from, but I was thinking, I wonder what would have happened if our leaders, we'd seen these awful events going on in Parliament House, where it's the centre of our country, and I wonder what would have happened if our leaders had responded in different ways and had shown themselves to be human, to have shown empathy, and to have acknowledged that there was an issue and done something to address it. And I think that is for me, that's so much part of what the rage is about, that there was no voice, the voices weren't heard. And I, completely agree with my colleagues here. We have, significant structural issues. This is the beginning or continuation, but it can't be where we stop.
Absolutely. And Phil, you were unfortunately unable to make it in person on Monday to the march, but as an observer from a distance and someone who's deeply involved in this work from a community health perspective, what are your observations?
Look, I think my personal reflections, I think, echo what everyone has already said. But I think I'm a bit more dismayed than everyone else is, feeling a little more upbeat. I think it's despairing. I think the level of anger is a result of years and years of lip service, as Julie said. That I think the enough slogan captures the mood that I'm seeing. It's people are just going, I'm calling BS on this. This structural inequality, the treatment of women in our society is not good enough. It's wrong. We all know it to be wrong, and yet it persists. And enough, because it's enough talking, something needs to be done. And, you know, I've had women in my life who have said, middle-aged women say, I've never marched for anything before, but I'm mad as hell and I'll march for this, because they just had a gutful. Just a gutful, and the lived experience of women every day being subject to feelings of feeling unsafe, feeling disrespected and unsafe in everything they do every day. It's just going enough. And yeah, and I think my dismay is that it hasn't changed. You know, we're not seeing the change we're seeing, and I think the anger that comes from Parliament House is like, oh, whatever, it's another workplace, you know, but this is happening in every workplace, you know, all over the place. I think the bit that makes it really, really insulting about the way that Canberra has reacted is, again, diminishing the voice and the experience of women by treating the issues, fundamental issues of crime being committed in the workplace as a political problem. You know, it's an inconvenience to men. You know, it's an inconvenience to the patriarchy, to men in power, that, you know, these women have caused us problems. And I think that's how it's playing out. That's what people are reading, and that's what people are saying. And I think that's at the heart of so much anger. And I think it's exposing, you know, boys' club mentality that exists in so many structures throughout society, whether it's Canberra, large corporations, the legal profession. Look at the High Court last year. You know, these bastions of male power, they will not cede. They will not cede their power to women easily, if at all. You know, they will not give up their power. It must be taken from them. I'm just despairing. I'm sorry. Look, the activist in me is so heartened to see people turning out on the streets, because it's the only way. The only way to make change is when people band together and say enough is enough, and we will show our presence and we will show our support. So the turn up absolutely fills me with joy.
Yeah, Phil, you just made some terrific observations and shared that sense of, you know, what enough is actually about. And the thing that I was also thinking about too, you know, we had that sense of momentum building, and this, you know, we've sort of been hearing people have marched for the first time in our lives, or they've marched, you know, 50 years on from the first time they did it, but they got out on the streets. And during February, through Gender Equality Victoria, there was a feminist February. So there was something on every week, a panel of some sort. And because of COVID, and, you know, a positive side of it is that it meant that digitally we were able to hear some of the most amazing people. And I was thinking particularly around the woman who leads the All Poland Women's Strike. Her name's Marta Lampart, and she spoke on one of those panels. And what she talked about is, you know, we've seen the coverage of the Polish women's marches. They are so powerful. They have brought that government to absolute account in terms of the legislative changes that actually prevented the changes to the abortion legislation that was going through. But Marta explained how did it come to be that there she was leading this extraordinary movement? And she said, look, 2 years ago, she felt to be a very ordinary housewife and mum, you know, part-time job, just going about her business. But she started to become enraged. She started to see enough is enough in so many things. And what she then commented on was that the movement is made up of lots of different women and people wanting to call out the injustices. So, you know, there's a woman who leads like a group in a particular community who works in a hardware store, and her employment conditions are actually very unfair. She's not earning an equal pay. And so for her, that's the reason she's active and collectively getting together the women in her community. And so on across Poland, that it's not necessarily a single issue that's bringing women together in that movement. It is the many issues, and those particular issues that, you know, we might feel very personally or see the injustice of it on those who we know or we hear the stories of. So it is so important that we hear the stories, that they're there to allow us to actually understand what difference the structural changes will make, and, you know, how fabulous, Kate, you mentioned it and the others too, how fabulous were those powerful stories from the women who are victim survivors, and each one of them gave us a terrific way to frame up the way in which we can actually be activists and, you know, stand beside them and ensure that we're creating a space that not only are our voices heard, but that we are calling, lovely point, Yvette, that we're calling for leadership that's compassionate. We're calling for leadership that is actually humane. And that's not only we're calling for it, that's what we expect. So we're not going to let it go until we actually start to see it.
I think that's really interesting about stories and compassion. And I was reflecting on, Yvette, what you said about if the government had have responded differently. And I was part of the Victorian, I guess, a working group that looked at the Verioc findings in regards to sexual harassment in workplaces. And one of the things that we talked about was, how do you educate workplaces? How do you use legislation to make workplaces safer, enact what they're meant to do under OH&S and wellbeing? And fundamentally, what we've seen is that Parliament is not a safe workplace. They did not use any of the levers they had at their disposal to investigate, to make women feel safe, to support them after disclosing sexual assault. They actually have just role modelled what across Australia we are trying to address to make workplaces safe as just one domain of where women feel unsafe. And I think that is part of the rage, is that even though people are working hard to make it almost impossible not to act, we saw our nation's leaders choosing not to act when they could have acted responsibly and with legislation behind them. So for me, that I find that reprehensible. I think it's about role modelling, it's about action, it's about reinforcing values that they espouse, and none of that's occurred. So for me, how do we activate a community against the people that hold the power, that have ignored their own established frameworks? So that's, for me, is a conundrum.
And Kate, these people that hold the power call themselves big swinging dicks.
Yeah.
So there lies the problem.
Yeah, and they have that element, which, we're all hearing about that. And I had a man who is very, woke or feminist, say to me, Sarah Everard in England, she was doing all of the right things and she still got attacked. And I said, let's maybe flip that and She was doing what she's entitled to do, and there is no right thing to do. Women, and he went, oh, yes, I just get what I've said. And I think that's the enculturated values that we were all raised with in different ways that are so difficult to challenge. And people revert to those values very easily. And I think that's our biggest challenge in moving forward. You're on mute, Nick.
Sorry, I thought I pressed it, I didn't. That's something that a lot of people are taking away from the march on Monday, Kate. It is, what can we do at a very real day-to-day level? How can we have those conversations? What can we be doing in our workplaces? What should we be doing more of to make sure this doesn't go away? We've got a momentum, we've got an energy. How do we make the most of that now? At a very real personal level, what can people be doing? And I guess I'll just put that out to any of you to respond to.
I just wanted to add something about believing victim survivors. You know, we have some of the signs the other day were amazing. You know, I believe you. And there was lip service about believing Brittany Higgins. Then she was called a lying cow. There was no acknowledgement of the deceased victim survivor having told any truth. And so that was sidetracked and gaslighted over into a mental health issue. You know, I think that the whole tenet of believing victim survivors has got to be paramount to everything we do in every part of society. And I was quite heartened yesterday. I was part of a consultation discussion group with a corporation that's trying to do better around violence against women in its workplace. And it presented its key principles. And the first two could have come straight out of the not-for-profit sector, which I was just amazed at. The first one was, this was in regard to victim survivors seeking exemptions or support from this corporation in regard to services. Their first principle was to believe the person on the end of the phone and not to ask for any proof or evidence that violence against them had happened. Now, how amazing is that this corporate aid organisation can do that? The second one was to focus on completely an empowerment response to that victim survivor that was phoning. So I think if we can see corporations like that stepping up to where we need to be, it is so it's just, I'm so angry that our leadership in federal parliament, our government, does not only no action, but completely erodes work that's done up until now and tries to take us completely backwards.
And so we know that sorry, you go, Yvette, jump in.
Oh, there's just so many things that that are running around my head in what you've just said, Julie. And there's the and my other colleagues here. One of the Centre for Non-Violence works with thousands of women a year who contact us to tell us that they are victims of family violence. And our first premise is always to believe, not seek evidence, believe. And without believing, you can't respond with compassion. And therein lies one of the issues. And even in our even with the significant changes in the response to family violence in Victoria in the last few years, we still see the pervading culture that women aren't to be believed, that they're up to something else, they're trying to get something. And this then goes back to our some of what Philip was saying before about our culture and the beliefs about men and their rights and women and their place, and these issues that we need to continue to work at. And well, we shouldn't have to, but we've got an underlying cultural issue here, which is which then plays out in the workplaces, including that of our capital. So there's an awful lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and I think for me, in every sort of forum that I'm at, I also want to bring it back to children and young people. And, you know, we provide therapeutic counselling for people who've experienced sexual assault. And today we had a staff meeting, and one of the things that we talked about from our agency advocacy perspective is we still have children in unsafe homes and in unsafe environments and I'll only talk from a sexual assault perspective. And this is a really important discussion, but we need to also recognise familial sexual assault, and that is still a very big part of our community, and that we all need to start wanting to engage in that discussion, because sometimes I think we get very focused on the attacks and rapes that may happen on the street by the unknown person, but we all know that in most cases we do know the perpetrator, and I think that's actually makes it even worse in some ways because it's such a betrayal of trust. So I just want to also bring that into this conversation as well.
I'm just going to echo that, and I was thinking the same when we were talking about believing her. I think remarkably, in some ways, I believe we've made as a society a huge shift in the last 25 years in believing children who are victim survivors of child sexual abuse is the sexual assault. And I think, how is it that we've got to a point where, you know, we've now got the memo that says listen to the child, but we still are debating whether we should listen to a woman. It's absurd to me, but we need to move on. I was also, you know, wanting to challenge the most important thing. I think there's probably lots of most important things, but for me, if I was to think about what does the next generation look like if it's a generation of men who are not perpetrators of violence against women, you know, what has to happen to breed the next generation where men do not become perpetrators? Because ultimately this is, you know, this is a men's issue. It's men are the problem here. You know, it's women doing all the work while men are the responsible party. So, you know, I think we need to ask ourselves, you know, what is it that we need to do for the next generation of men so that they are not perpetrators? And I think a lot of that comes back to tackling head on this sense of entitlement. I think so much of what happens in raising boys leads to a sense of entitlement, and that's entitlement for everything, including women, and that's at the heart, I think, of so much family violence, but disrespect and violence against women comes from a male sense of entitlement, and I think we've got to sort of name that up and tackle that head on.
And it's interesting you say that, Phil, because you would say the feminist movement has been actually naming entitlement in males for a very long time, and yet we're seeing at a political level that entitlement play out in the worst possible way. So I guess what sort of language could we be using to help people understand that at a very real level? Because it doesn't seem to be having an impact at the moment.
No, I think, and I think it's you know, it's being said by women, but not by men. I think just acknowledging my own privilege. You know, I'm white, middle-aged, middle-class, cisgendered, heterosexual, and with no visible disability that impacts my daily living. You know, I'm the pinnacle of privilege. But there are so many men who share exactly the same profile I have, who would have no grasp of the privilege they live to. I think that the support of Trump's America, the support that Trump gets in America, it comes from people who are privileged but deny the privilege that they have. And so I think, you know, we have men and white men, white heterosexual cisgendered men, have an absolute responsibility to start talking to other men about the privilege we experience by just good luck, you know, and I think that's a conversation that men have not had enough of with other men.
You're onto it, Phil. Every man needs to be part of this. We need all men to step into not just the conversation, we need men to step in and call it out. We need excuse me, we need them to call out the fact that there are so many men who are not comfortable in those gender stereotypes of masculinity. We need them to speak up. We need to see that it's actually those really rigid gender stereotypes of masculinity are harmful to our whole society. We need every man to be able to say to the men around them, I'm listening to women. I'm hearing what's happening to women. What can we do about it? And what you can do about it is continue to talk to other men as you listen to women, not just you, but all men, and have the conversation. Say, look, that's not on. That behaviour is not on. It's not right. It's simply not right. The other thing that can, so often in that bystander role too for men, not only just, taking your mate aside or calling it out or their colleague or, reflecting it back and describing it, is also to be supportive of women who are at the end of that sexism, to check in, and say, how are you? How did, what was happening there? Do you need support? Can I help? There are so many ways in which men can be really active every day in every conversation, every relationship, to actually make a difference. And I'm just recalling, at that federal level, when there was a response to the last budget and the lack of investment in women in the last federal budget. And when that was called out by absolutely eminent women economists and social commentators and etc., there was the Prime Minister's office who actually said that there wasn't much credibility in that. So that anger stoked and provoked and created that movement called Credible Women. We need credible men. We need the credibility needs to come from a conversation that men are part of, and do not silence women's voices in doing it. Listen, and then have your own conversations that will make a difference. So yeah, there's lots, isn't there? There's lots to cover in it, but we are all capable of making a difference.
I think there's layers in it as well, and I think whilst I think conversation and the bystander approach is fabulous, to me that's almost like a tertiary intervention in the violence continuum. And I think for me, if you look more upstream at prevention, for me it's more around that the prevention spend in a budget needs to be increased. It needs to be increased and spent in earlier life stages. It needs to be spent in a real time way, and it needs to be spent in a sustainable way. So projects that look at one-off things about how to change, a whole small town's view of gender, and then you leave, is not sustainable, and the change really isn't tangible. So for me, it's around shifting the budget spend, looking at what is equity, and really starting to not be trying to repair sort of entitlement, but actually breeding equity. So yeah. I don't know how we'd get there.
Couldn't agree more, Kate. In fact, Respect Victoria did the analysis in terms of what's the budget spend that's required to do the prevention work, as we're saying. And, World Health Organization and United Nations work that's gone on globally, but generally the view is that 12% of a health budget needs to be spent on the prevention dollar. In Victoria, we have less than 3% of that. So that's, straight up, that's what structural change is about. It's actually getting the investment and making sure the investment does what it needs to do upstream. You're absolutely right in terms of considering, bystander is something we can do in the moment, but there's so much more that needs to be done to restructure.
And a bipartisan commitment to the prevention spend is incredibly important, because the outcomes you won't see for a long, long time post your term of government usually. So,
yeah. So that requires, we're saying it's the compassionate, the informed leadership, and it isn't a political issue. It's actually much, much bigger than that.
This is another reason why it's so disappointing with what's happening at federal level, because they're in the 4th action plan of the national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. So there's been three-year plans already, and this is the 4th of the 4th, where they're supposed to have turned the corner, and they're supposed to now be reducing violence against women, gender-based violence against women. It's actually increasing, and there's obviously increased reporting, increased pathways to services, but some of the indicators that they're using, which is the Australian Bureau of Statistics Personal Safety Survey and the National Community Attitude Survey, show that the prevalence, particularly in some cohorts, is increasing. And also the attitudes in some cohorts are actually deteriorating, particularly in young men around about the age of 17 to 19 years old, and also in young boys as young as 10 or 11 years old. Some of the research showed that even the attitudes of young girls is disturbing. So I'm trying to support the earlier, the better here, because some of the research said that 10-year-old girls were asked what they would think about if a boy hit them in the face, and some of them said it would be all right as long as it didn't leave a bruise. So those sorts of things, it's not just the boys, it's the gender stereotyping that is still existing in our children and our young people. But to see some of the community attitudes go backwards in cohorts like 17 to 19-year-old males, particularly around, and the general community too, around consent, is really, really disturbing. So I think that's something we have to really focus on.
And when I talk about enculturated values, it is for both women and men, because it's not one having a worse set of enculturated values. I think it happens, and then the entitlement comes in on top of that for men. But the community attitudes are alarming, and they have significantly put women at more risk in a lot of ways. And I think part of that is actually the access to pornography, and how pornography is violent. Women are always subjected to things that they don't always consent to. And I think because it's free and accessible and children access it earlier and earlier, there is something that really needs to be done about pornography. I don't have the answer, but it's really having an impact.
And Kate, it was interesting listening to the speakers at the Bendigo March for Justice, and Emily in particular talked about consent and what consent looks like. And I guess that just reiterates the importance of us really listening to victim survivors and hearing what they have to say and educating us on their experiences. But the great thing about Bendigo and many of the other marches or gatherings or rallies on Monday was the diversity of voices, and how important is it that we keep listening to a very diverse group of women to make sure that we're capturing every experience and responding to that.
Nick, I just thought it was fabulous the way Emily framed up consent. So if we think about consent and we think about sovereignty for Aboriginal people, and as we all live on lands that have never been ceded, it is the ultimate understanding of consent that we have not acknowledged in our country and in the principles on which our democracy is actually built. So consent's a very, very, very big discussion, and it is structural as well in terms of understanding that, and in all aspects of what human rights are for our nation. I thought it was just a terrific way to frame it.
I think consent has been in the national dialogue as well. And as I said on Monday, rolling out a consent program is not going to fix the problem. And I think consent is generally brought into classrooms too late. And a lot of teachers have told us they're not comfortable running respectful relationships. They find it's, another add-on to what they have signed up for. And I think we really need to think about when is consent engaged within schools. But I think we also need to support families with how consent can be engaged within the home environment, because there's a tension around where it sits at the moment, and definitely too late, but how do we actually have that conversation earlier?
So I'm mindful that we're almost at 4:50 and we'll be getting some question time in shortly. So what we might do is just actually ask each of you to perhaps just briefly talk about what can people do from here? What do we need to do as a collective from here? Do you have any thoughts about next steps to maintain the rage, and how people who are attending this webinar might be able to walk away and just implement a few things that they can do in their own environments to make change?
Nick, I immediately wanted to organise another march straight away after the Prime Minister's comments that how good is it that we can march here without getting shot?
Weren't we lucky, Julie?
Aren't we lucky?
I actually support another march as well, and I think it could be an actual march and looking at Reclaim the Night or a silent march. But I think we have to repeat activities to have impact, because memories fade. And the other thing I'm interested in is feminism in the pub, and having conversations with and about feminists and feminism to keep dialogue going in a very casual, unpressured way. So that's what I'm kind of looking at.
Great.
I'll jump. Oh, you go ahead.
No, please do, Phil. Go ahead.
I saw an example. I used to live in an apartment block, which was massive, like 700 units on like 4.5 acres in Brunswick. And it has its own little community Facebook page. And one of the male members last night posted to the community to say, as a bloke, it disturbs me that women in our community don't feel safe. What is it that we as men can do to address that situation? And it was extraordinary, the response from women who talked about their lived experience in this large apartment block, this community. And it was everything that you would expect, feeling feeling the presence of creepy men, low-level predation, harassment, looks and stares, to which I think a lot of the men then responded with, somewhat disbelief and sorrow, but it created an insight for the men in that group into the lived experience of women, which was really powerful. I think it did nothing, it probably did nothing to the creeps who know that they're creeps, and it's probably not going to change their behaviour, but it did open up a conversation for the whole residential community about what lived experience is like and what men can do to address it. So for the men in the audience, I would be saying have those conversations with other men and have those conversations with women in your life and women in your workplace, and have them overtly and share that experience, because I think men don't have the same lived experience of fearing for themselves and their personal safety walking from the train station to the car. Women have that experience every single day, and men just don't get it. They just don't live it. They don't know it, and until they're shared those stories in a personal way, they won't get it. So I encourage all men to open that dialogue with other men and women in your life.
I think it's clearly a time of hearing from women and children with lived experience, and supporting those voices to be the loudest voices, and to tell the stories. And I think, you know, going back to where I started from, the energy and anger of young women, and thinking about the group of us who are here today, joining with, which I know we are, but very happy to, but we're part of an older generation, and the importance of the generations joining together and bringing the energy of young women. I think, I'm also really conscious that we need to ensure that we are hearing, and this happened the other day, but that we're hearing the voices of women with, you know, from diverse backgrounds, women who experience the intersection of, you know, sexism and racism and or ableism, and that's just so important. It's important for us as well. I'm you know, a white, well, I come with a lot of privilege, and I also need to be reminded and hear those stories. But I would like to just convey, a friend of mine took her, I think, let's say about a 12-year-old daughter to the march in Melbourne, and she posted on social media her reflections on the march, and she said, and I think this is the, you know, a reminder about why these things are important, why gathering together is important. I hope that if ever or whenever, and she's put whenever in quotation marks, which is sad that she thinks that there will be a time that my daughter encounters injustice, she can remember the energy of the crowds today and let that give her the courage and strength to call it out. I just thought that was a really good reminder about one of the reasons we gather and protest.
Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful, Yvette. What a great thing to pass on and to share as well. So absolutely, it is about making sure that we don't lose sight of the things we've learned as we've come along, and that we do share those learnings. Along with the rage, along with the anger. You can only sustain rage for so long before it starts to deplete you. So we need to really tune into the things that are giving us hope. And hope is knowing that you're not alone. Hope is knowing that you're heard and believed. Hope is knowing that you can actually be part of the change that needs to happen. And hope is also making sure that we can engage with those who are very powerful in our communities, who are the decision makers, whether it's in workplaces or in civic life, sporting life, whatever that may be, that we really engage that leadership to be part of this change, this momentum. And yeah, I love the idea of us being able to gather and keep that energy at the, you know, sort of being built and nurtured as it goes along.
Thank you, everyone. I've just popped a little note into the chat asking if anyone has any questions for the panel, so I'll quickly just monitor that. But I think there is a question there. How do we change the people in power who are setting such a bad example, and how can we make the leaders of this country accountable for their actions and the decisions they make?
One thing we can do is vote. There's an election coming up.
That's our most powerful tool at the moment.
The voice of the community, that's the most powerful tool, isn't it? So that's what we're saying. Yep. Let's make sure it's used to not just used in the vote, but it's also used to lift up the leadership we need. You know, that compassionate leadership, that leadership that will actually be able to not just hear, but, you know, progress and make the changes we need.
But I think as well that there's some worth. There are one of the things that I noticed that there was a lot of women from politics at the marches and who have spoken out since, and we should be giving them their support, and men as well, giving support to them and contacting our leaders and letting them know what we think about their responses. I think that's really important. I'm not so crash hot at that myself, but it's something that I think is really important at the moment.
I think in addition to voting, we have to keep the memory alive And that's why I think we do need continued action and activities and dialogue about this, because the news cycle is very fast and who knows what is going to be happening before an election is held, that this will fade. So I think it's up to people that work in the area and other people who are committed and active in the space to work with us to actually look at what we can do to keep it loud and angry and visible.
And it's interesting you say that, Kate, because a couple of people have just commented in the chat, how do they find out what's happening next and how can we continue to collaborate and find out who wants to be involved? So I think as a consortium, there's potential for us to come together very soon to maybe think about some of these things and how we can bring everybody in and keep the momentum going.
Yeah, a rolling plan of action would be a good idea.
Absolutely. So on that note, we'll thank our panellists and also thank everyone for coming along and listening today. And by all means, if you are one of the attendees and would like to get involved or have any thoughts, feel free to contact any of our organisations. We are all talking very much about next steps and pretty excited about what's to come, because we're not going to stop making noise. We have had enough, but we haven't had enough of making noise. So thanks everyone for coming, and hopefully we'll see you all again very soon.